Hey YouTubers, this is Barcode checking in again. As many of you know, I've mentioned quite a few times that my favorite book in the comprehensible universe is Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. I've gotten quite a lot of private messages from my viewers asking me why, in particular, this particular book, what I see in it. Most recently, the question has been asked by a user by the name of Nick INTP. I'm presuming that this means that your name is Nick and that you are also an INTP, so hello Nick. So this is not a book review, this is just mine sort of interpretation, and it's meant as more of a guide rather than a set interpretation, because I do believe that Heart of Darkness is one of those books that you need to really think about yourself. So Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. I am a believer that if you're going to read a piece of literature and try to understand it, first of all, you're not going to read it once. I mean, Heart of Darkness is not, this is not a book that you can read once and understand. This is not a book that you can read twice and understand. This is not a book that you can read in part. Nick informed me that he's actually only halfway through it, so I encourage you, Nick, to finish it. It's also not a piece of literature that can be read in segments. I have some colleagues that do like flipping through various pieces of literature in this time period, but obviously they do so because they've already read it. So if it's your first time, I encourage you not to jump around. But to a second major thing to understand a piece of literature is to understand the author. So Joseph Conrad, he was originally Polish, but he later became a British citizen. So there's a few sort of major things that you need to know about Conrad. I encourage you, if you want, to read some of his other works. They're not as strong in my opinion, but it really helps to understand what Conrad was thinking, what his life situation was like, what his political orientation was at the time of writing. So Conrad, the biggest things that I can think about in terms of Conrad is, first of all, is that he was in the Navy. If you've read other books such as, say, Lord Jim or Nigger of the Narcissus, you see the theme of the ocean crop up quite a lot, and this is because Conrad spent quite a lot of time in his youth and young adult years in first the French and then later the British Merchant Navy. And he saw the sea as a very powerful symbol, a symbol of the unknown, a symbol of freedom, and more importantly, a symbol of terror. It was something, the sea was something that was both loved and hated, something that was both respected, revered, and yet feared. There's a huge sort of nautical element to it. The ocean was really big for Conrad. So in that sense, it represented a sense of grandeur. A grandeur that he could not articulate into words, but that you see crop up quite a lot in a lot of his works. And again, this goes back to his heavy Navy roots, where literally, as a sailor, you would look into the horizon and you just see darkness. You don't know what's out there, and it's just this sense of foreboding that you feel so small in this huge universe. That sense of grandeur about knowing how small you are. One more thing about Conrad is Conrad wasn't the happiest guy around. I mean, he was, you know, he suffered from several bouts of major depressive disorder or depression throughout his lifetime. He was a very pessimistic guy. A lot of his works and a lot of his sort of letters revolved around sort of his need to rein in romanticism, which was sort of rampant during the Victorian era. Reined it in with sort of a scathing sense of moral judgment and moral commentary. So he was not a happy guy. He was actually sort of more of a cynic. So in that regard, a lot of people, well, I'll talk about this later, but a lot of people like to see Heart of Darkness as a work of sort of triumph of the human nature, but I disagree, and I know a lot of other scholars also disagree with this. I don't see Heart of Darkness. It is not a work of triumph. It is a work of tragedy. So just keep that in mind when you're reading it. So the basic plot, there's Marlowe. So Marlowe is basically the audience or the reader's surrogate. This basically means that Marlowe is the one that the reader identifies with, and you view the world through his eyes. Interestingly enough, I should mention at this point that there's three major characters in the novel. Marlowe, which I guess you could say is the protagonist, but he ends up being sort of the anti-hero in the end. There's Kurtz, who is this sort of mysterious guy. There's also a third unnamed narrator, which you don't, it's a little mysterious and it's kind of fascinating. You don't quite know that much about him. I mean, he's mentioned a few times, but it's this sort of unnamed narrator. A lot of scholars speculate that maybe he's Conrad himself. This is his way of injecting his voice. And yet, you know, if you read some of his other works, it seems like his his point of view may align more closely with Marlowe or of Kurtz than the narrator in particular. But I'll leave that interpretation up to you. But keep an eye out for that unnamed narrator. I mean, it's a very mysterious presence that a lot of people can miss if they skim over the novel. So Marlowe is journeying into the African Congo. Keep in mind that this was the Victorian era. This was very much the time of European colonialism, imperialism. Africa was also known at that time as the Dark Continent. So you have this sense of imperialism, of the Europeans coming in, bringing the light, bringing the beacon of civilization into the darkness of Africa. So literally, as Marlowe journeys into Africa, known as the Dark Continent, he's also figuratively journeying into the heart of darkness on Earth, or as Europeans knew it at that time. And as he's journeying in, he keeps hearing from a lot of the people who are working there about this mysterious man named Kurtz. You don't ever meet Kurtz until the climax of the story, and meeting Kurtz is the climax of the story. Up till then, the book is rather monotonous, and yet once in a while, you hear these sort of these people talking about Kurtz, and they talk about him. Keep an eye out for this. They talk about him like he's a god. Like he's more than human. He's the ideal European colonial man, and he's perfect, and he's bringing that light of morality and civilization into the uncivilized dark. So basically, Kurtz heads in. Marlowe heads into Africa. He sees all these quote unquote barbarian African natives, and then he meets Kurtz, and that's it. I mean, plot-wise, it's not that profound, but it's reading between the lines. Some recurring themes to keep an eye out for. I should mention light and dark, black and white. A lot of light versus dark imagery. Very, very little gray imagery. Actually, I actually wrote a thesis on this once. It's you see very, very little gray imagery, but I do think that Conrad did this intentionally because the point, I think, the ultimate message of his novella is that black and white, light and dark, the world isn't like that. There are shades of gray. There are always shades of gray. And yet, funny enough, he illustrates this by making the book in complete polarizations, complete absolutes, very little moral gray, very little figurative gray, and also very little literal gray. So you see very little sort of physical objects that are of gray color. It's always light or dark, oh, these black-skinned natives, these white-skinned Europeans, and you never see anything in between. So keep an eye out for that. Another big thing you should keep an eye out for is idealism. Again, Conrad was not a very happy guy. He believed that romanticism is something that should be fought, because to see the actual state of the universe, one needs to sort of rein in that sense of idealism. Finally, I should say that the sort of overarching theme you should keep in mind is that this is not a work of triumph. The pivotal scene in the book is a scene in which Marlowe meets Kurtz, and Kurtz utters a very important phrase in English literature. He says, "The horror, the horror." I mean, what exactly is so horrible? You never really find out. My interpretation of it is that Kurtz has looked into himself, found the darkness within himself, and uttered the horror in sort of a final gasp of desperation, which is also his last breath. The overarching point of this novella is illustrated quite well in the dual interpretations that are present in the title itself. So the title itself, Heart of Darkness, can be interpreted two ways. The first way it can be interpreted is sort of the literal way, right? So it's literally the heart of darkness, which implies that darkness has a heart, that this heart of darkness is external to oneself, so it's in your environment, and that you are basically physically journeying towards it. So that, at first interpretation, is basically what Marlowe is doing. He's physically journeying into the heart of darkness. The second interpretation, which I believe is the interpretation that Conrad intended, is not the heart of darkness. It is a heart composed of darkness, which implies that if you're looking for evil, all someone needs to do is to look within himself, and he will find it there. So whether or not you want to see this as a triumph or a tragedy, I will leave that up to you. But if you have any questions, maybe I'll talk about this a little bit more. But yeah, happy reading and good luck, Nick, and all my viewers. Thanks.